Good morning and welcome to everyone at today's virtual event discussing electronic records modernization. And thank you very much to our sponsors, to Federal Computer Week and QAI for sponsoring this event. I am Lisa Hare-Lampus, and I come from the National Archives and Records Administration. For those of you who may not be familiar with our agency, we are a medium-sized federal agency. We have about 2,700 employees. We are of about an annual budget of about $350 million a year. And what many people don't realize is that we're actually truly a national archives. We run the presidential libraries. We run and administer federal regional archival facilities throughout the country. And we administer our Federal Records Center program. Our Federal Records Center program is a series of warehouses throughout the country where we store and manage federal records on behalf of federal agencies. And you'll be hearing more about that very soon. So I thank you for coming. I'm going to jump into the presentation. And my hallmarks of this time, this unusual business environment that we're in, is I just ask for a little patience and a little perseverance. And I know we'll get through today's session and hopefully have wonderful conversations and be able to connect throughout the day. So let me start with my first slide. I'm going to, again, patience and perseverance. There we go. First, I'd like to offer a little grounding in some of the foundation guidance that explains where we're coming from. Where is the National Archives coming from, and where is the federal government getting its vision and direction? So there are 3 documents that I have described on this screen, and I'm not sure if we're going to share slides afterwards. I know that's something that people like to do. If you will, you'll be able to click on those hyperlinks and go there. But if not, I'm sure you'll be able to find them. The 3 documents I want to talk about as foundation are the Transitioning to Electronics Memorandum that was issued jointly by the Office of Management and Budget and the National Archives. This guidance came out in June of 2019. It is an OMB memo, which is why it has the number M, the fiscal year 19, and it was the 21st memo of that year. I did spend some time looking at other OMB memos this weekend that were issued this weekend, all about COVID planning. There is now an OMB memo 2019, but I know we're clever and will not get confused between 2119 and 1921. This memo issues some pretty foundational guidance on what agencies have to do to transition to electronic record keeping. But it wasn't the first. The first document that we issued was the NARA strategic plan that came out in February of 2018. And at that point, it described what NARA was going to do in this space, what we would do as an agency that is both responsible for managing our national archives, preserving the history of the federal government, and as our agency name implies, we also do records administration. So that guidance in 2018 said, this is what NARA is going to do. And it gave a glimpse of what agencies were going to have to do for our strategic plans. And the third document that I think is an important piece of this foundation was the President's Government Reform Plan that was issued in June 2018. That really talked about a lot of cross-agency priorities. It talked about how the federal government was going to modernize, improve technology, and how we were going to be doing better at delivering services throughout the nation. And in that government reform plan, you will find mention of the National Archives. You find a page and a description. There's a whole piece on how the federal government needs to transition to digital government, and from my perspective, or the archives perspective, transition to electronic record keeping. So that's where we started. And for those of you who've read those documents, congratulations. For those of you who just want me to tell you the main takeaway, here's the headline that came from those 3 documents and from M1921. The first goal and the first vision is really setting the marker that all federal records will be created, retained, and managed in electronic format. So just to be very clear, The goal in M1921 that we've been building to for years and years is please stop managing records in paper. Manage all federal records, and the definition of a record is very broad. So you can definitely say manage all federal information, all federal records, all federal data electronically, so that and in the most efficient and effective manner possible. And my only editorial comment I'll make is I'm very glad we've been on this path for the past 10 years, because I feel a lot of agencies are able to go in certain ways to 100% telework because they've been working on this path. They've been pushing different areas of their organization forward to electronic records management. And so we may not be 100% there yet, but I feel that we're in such a stronger place today than we would have been without this direction that we've been heading. The second headline, which was perhaps a surprise to some, and we're still working through that, still have paper. We know that most agencies have some sort of paper that's been created in the, as I like to say, as a radio broadcast, that were created in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And how is those paper records being managed? Ideally, those records might be transformed and digitized and somehow turned into electronic records so that we can use that information the way we need to use it in agencies. But if they're still being stored in paper as they wait their final disposition, the OMB memo requires agencies to develop plans to stop storing them in agency-operated facilities and move them either to a NARA Federal Record Center or to a commercial record center. So for me, the headline is that the directive says no matter what federal agencies have done in the past, at this point, they need to do something. They need to either move to fully electronic or they need to move paper records into the most efficient and effective storage that we can find. So that's the headline. And anybody who knows in good bureaucracy, you always sort of state your vision and then you state your targets or goals. And you look at how can we move forward? What's the target we're going to meet? I'm just going to briefly talk about this slide because this is the target that the National Archives and OPM are involved in. And this is the target that came from our previous guidance. So we're in 2020, but I wanted to let everybody know that there was a previous target that said by 2019, agencies are going to manage all of their permanent electronic records in electronic formats, And what that means in the layman's terms is that of all of the vast amounts of federal information and federal records that are created every year, a small percentage is designated historically valuable or permanent. And those permanently valuable historical records come to the National Archives. And we had a target that said by 2019, if agencies are creating permanently valuable records in an electronic format, they need to be transferred to the National Archives in an electronic format. In other words, please do not take the wonderful, rich electronic records that you've created and print them out and send them to us. And a good example of that could be if agencies had permanent records on their website, we would like to have those permanent records sent to us. We would not want agencies to be printing their website and sending us boxes of records. That deadline was December 31st, 2019. The National Archives is currently conducting our annual records management reporting activity, which we do every year. And we're hoping to gather more data that we'll be able to share with your community, with this community, with others, to let us know how successful the federal government has been on a whole at meeting that target. We're asking questions going into it, and people were replied that they're pretty sure they could manage to do this. Born electronic, stay electronic, and send to the National Archives. So we think we're expecting a great deal of success with that goal. The other two goals that are out here right now that we wanted to share is what was NARA doing to help agencies meet that vision, that headline. And we are working in 2020 to revise our regulations and to create guidance to support agencies as they make this transition. And that is what the second half of my brief remarks are going to be about today with Fermi. And the third thing is we always talk people, processes, technology. We have the technology, we're working on the processes, and OPM was required in the M1921 directive to look at certain position classifications in archives and records management to make sure that we have the skill sets that we're going to need listed in those position descriptions, because we all are going to be moving towards electronic record keeping, and the skill sets you need for electronic record keeping and paper record keeping are a little different, although there are some similarities with intellectual control. So that was what's happening sort of on our side. What I want to spend a little more time on are the 2022 transformational targets. This is the area that came out of the strategic plan, the cross-agency priority, and the OMB directive. And we have some new targets that we're setting, some new goals for the federal government to reach that we think are going to help us on this transition, on this journey to fully digital government. The first is that by 2022, those permanent records I just described, I said before, a minute ago, if they were born electronic, they stay electronic. This target says no matter what format they were created, no matter if they're in a paper or other analog format, by 2022, the National Archives wants to receive all historically valuable permanent records in electronic format to the greatest extent possible. The next goal says that regardless of whether or not it's permanent, all temporary records should also be stored in an electronic, or should be managed in an electronic format. And if they are still in paper, then they need to be stored in commercial facilities. The fourth goal, or the next goal, I should say, 2.4, the third bullet on this slide, is that, again, by 2022, NARA is no longer going to accept the transfer of permanent or temporary records in analog or paper format. And it's sort of saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take these records with all of the metadata we need and the formats that we can sustain, and we are going to be managing records electronically. So I'll let that sink in and set for a moment, and I'm sure there'll be some questions about these goals. The piece I did not put on the slide is that the targets say, these are the goals. We have until December 2022 to really push hard and manage our legacy paper or transform our electronic records to the greatest extent possible. There was a recognition from the directive authors that some agencies may need a little more time, or there are some areas that require more attention. The National Archives is required to issue an exceptions process, and we are working on that so that agencies can say, well, I'm moving this direction, but 2022 is not realistic given our budget and our current plans. So we will have exception guidance coming. But what I can say is the plans for the exception guidance is not that agencies would be sending us multiple requests saying, well, what about this box? What about this series? It's more of a strategic plan exception guidance where agencies look at their records management programs and their information programs as a whole and say, okay, for this main body of records, we are moving electronic, but our scanning operation won't be completed until 2025 or something along those lines. So those are our targets. I said at the beginning that NARA has our goal in 2020 to provide both guidance and policy support to help agencies meet that target. And what I'm going to do now is spend a little time talking about FERMI. It's our initiative that we have put in place to help us help agencies get to that goal. I'm also doing a quick time check. Please let me know, moderators, if I need to speed up or slow down, because I know that we're doing this electronically and we're not in the room, so I don't get my 5-minute, 10-minute warning. So if you guys will help me stay on track, I really appreciate it. Because I can talk about FERMI for a long time. I get very excited about this initiative that my colleagues and I at the National Archives are doing in cooperation with OMB and GSA. So what is Fermi? We have our picture of Enrico Fermi on the slide. It is the Federal Electronic Records Modernization Initiative from the National Archive. We think the acronym is lovely because we sometimes say this shouldn't be as hard as rocket science, and yet sometimes it does feel that way. And also it's important to ground it that the National Archives knows how to write policy. We have been very good at telling agencies through regulations and NARA bulletins what has to happen to be effective at maintaining a records management program. But we were not always as effective at answering the how questions. So with the transformation of digital records, we started hearing more and more, I have support, my executives are on board, we want to move with digital transformation. How should we be doing this? What should some of our steps be to put the tools and services in place that we need? So the National Archives, we took a deep breath and we said, let's see how we can work in this space to help agencies transform. We've created our initiative and we found some partners. So Fermi is our attempt to help agencies obtain ERM solutions that meet their needs. And there's a wide variety of needs, and it's generally not a one size fits all. So we tried to look at ways to partner and help agencies do that. And it was a commitment on our part to stay very proactive, looking how trends are constantly changing in the ERM space, and make sure that our policies are keeping abreast with technology as agencies are transforming. So I like this slide. I know it's very busy, so let me explain what I want to sort of have the takeaway here. The National Archives is not doing Fermi on our own. We have partnerships with GSA, and we've been working with OMB. This slide comes from the president's the CAP plan, those priority plans, and it sort of lays out, as this is an OMB and GSA slide, on how shared services work and how the shared service governance and operating model works. We start at the top with OMB and the President's Management Councils. Underneath that, there are several shared solution groups that are working to try to leverage the federal buying power to try and standardize our requirements for common activities that happen across the federal government. For those of us in NARA know that from a records perspective, we have often looked at records management that way. There are general records schedules that cover functions and records that are created commonly across the government, and then there are specific agency schedules that cover mission. So in this broader scheme, there are councils and there are standards groups that are trying to make sure that we're able to do common administrative functions across the board in a similar way, and those are coordinated through a business council. Fermi and my colleagues at the National Archive, we are in the gray box that says standards lead. NARA is the standards lead for electronic records management, which means that is where we get to help share with agencies, as we've always done, what standards they should be following for electronic records management. And we get to share that information with the Business Council and the other shared services providers and governance entities, because we're part of that space as well. So that's the first partnership. We have partnered with OMB and GSA on shared services. My next slide talks about the Federal Integrated Business Framework. From my perspective, or from the Fermi perspective, we are creating standards products that are done in the same style with the same structure that the rest of our shared service providers are following. So GSA set up with their Office of Shared Service Performance Improvement, OSPI, a federal integrated business framework that says that all of these shared service providers, if we want to do shared services effectively, including records management or electronic records management, we have to know, well, what is our life cycle? What is our service activities list? What are the business capabilities, the use cases, the data standards, and the performance? So that's where we're coming from. And I'm going to run through those products that we have created now as standards products and sort of help you understand what we've created and how it relates. So the
Excuse me,
first
Lisa,
thing
I
we've
want to
created
interject for just
is
one moment.
universal.
Just wanted to give you you've got about 5 minutes, and we do have the questions starting to pour in, so I want to make sure that we allow time. So definitely have room to keep going, but just wanted to give you a time check.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate that. Those were issued, the universal requirements were issued in 2017, and I wanted to let you know that we are updating them, and we're expecting to have them out very soon as the latest set of requirements. We have been gathering feedback for the past 2 years, and we did a push this past year in 2020 to make sure that we had the requirements up and running, taking input from agencies and vendors as they've been providing solutions. The second piece of guidance we have is our business lifecycle and capabilities document. Both the requirements, the universal requirements, and the business lifecycle capabilities are on our website, and they help you understand how the National Archives is looking at ERM. The requirements, the lifecycle capabilities are written very technically, and they're written very succinct and precise. So to help make sure that it's really clear what we meant with those requirements, we are developing a series of use cases. The use cases also help explain who are the actors, who are the roles, what are the inputs and outputs, and how does this work together? We have developed a use case for electronic messages or email. We went with that one first because that is the 2016 goal that I'm not talking about now, but we had a 2016 goal to manage email electronically. We've also developed a social media records use case that is in draft, and that is also found available on our blog, which is where we've shared our thinking. And we are currently creating a universal use case, which will help explain how those universal requirements work in toto. One of the things that is not yet available, but I wanted to give you a heads up, will be coming out this year or next fiscal year, is our set of data items. We've been trying to provide a baseline which can be used to make sure that when we talk about what's a record, what's metadata, what are these different action items, we have the same data dictionary. And so we're working to provide those data items as well. What I'd like to make clear, before I go to the next slide, is that the policy and data and standards work that we're doing is all based on current laws, current regulations, current NARA guidance, international standards, NIST standards, whatever we can find to be that's related to electronic records. We're really synthesizing and putting those pieces together as standards leads. One of the next part of Fermi is that we took that synthesis, we're taking that information, and we have been sharing that with GSA's category management team. So we have one partnership with OSPI, we have one partnership with GSA category managers. The category managers in Schedule 36 are GSA's team that has helped find electronic records management solutions and records management solutions, and they've been doing this work also for decades. What we've been doing with GSA is trying to make sure that the records management solutions they've offered in the past also contain ERM solutions. So we have a new special item specifically for electronic records management solutions. Vendors who are on that schedule self-certify that they can meet our universal requirements. They are available. There's over 42 different vendors and solutions that are able to meet those requirements. And so with GSA's assistance, we have been telling agencies that if you need ERM solutions and services, one, you can use the Fermi standards and our work as basic work for starting a statement of work or a request for quote or a request for information. Or they can work with the category managers to see if there's market research or vendors that are already available on a schedule that they could reach and find and get their services in a effective procurement process as possible. So that is our I'm just going to leave that right there, as we have two different partnerships, one for standards, one for category management. And I'd like to put out there that you can reach us or reach the Fermi or GSA. This is our journey that we've been on. This is to show you what's coming up. We are hoping to have those data standard items and the universal use cases and another industry day in 2020 in support of this transformation. So I am going to leave you on this slide. I'm skipping the question slide because we said questions would be coming. I wanted to mention, as I was saying, that there are more contacts for more information. I recommend you follow our Records Express blog where we share information about Fermi. Or if you want to go to our Fermi website, you'll be able to find those products that I mentioned. And last but not least, if you're like, yes, Lisa, I got this all, I understand it. What I really want to talk about is how to get tools and solutions. That is the Schedule 36 email. They're actually records management at GSA, and they can help agencies understand how to procure solutions, or they can help vendors figure out how to get on their schedules. So I'm going to close it with those remarks, and I will say that I'm ready for an open for questions.
Thank you very, very much, Lisa. And see if I can put these in a little bit of a structured order. We have some very specific questions, which I'll get to, but at the bigger picture level, one of our attendees asked whether agencies should have a, quote, point-forward approach, meaning that the focus would be on any records created from a certain date forward would be born electronically, but legacy documents would live and die in paper format as the resources it takes to convert them to digital may not be available. I know you've talked in your presentation about both of those things at a certain level, but is that a strategy that you think works? Is there any kind of starting point advice you could offer to those agencies?
Thank you for the question. And I'm afraid the answer is no. For the M1921, it is not a day forward solution. NARA definitely has issued guidance in the past where he said, from this point day forward, this is how we want records to be maintained. But the vision of M1921 is it's actually looking towards the past. So you're absolutely correct in your question. Converting, I say legacy, but that's really a term of art, converting paper records that were created in the 80s or the 90s or today. I'm stopping with the 70s. If we're still talking about paper records in the 70s, we should probably have a separate offline conversation. But to reasonably say there's records that have been created and maintained under your organization's control for 30 years because that was their retention. And you still need to keep them for another 10, 15, or those are historical records that are coming to the National Archives. What should you do? With this guidance, the answer is if they are permanent, coming to the National Archives, if you are able to transfer them to a federal record center by December 31st, 2022, then you will not have to digitize those records and transform them into an electronic version to come to the National Archives. That is the intention. I think I always talk about the intended consequence. A lot of times guidance has unintended consequence. You can't quite foresee how it's going to be interpreted in every situation. But the intended consequence of M1921 is to tell agencies, if you've got permanent paper records, you've been storing them for your own access or reference purposes, now is the time to send them to the federal record centers, and then that require Federal Record Services will service them for you, as we always have done, and then they will be transferred in paper to the National Archives. So it's sort of a driver to get the National Archives' hands around collections of records that were still in paper, still have historical value, but perhaps not enough current business value to warrant digitization, because digitization is not cheap. Your question was absolutely correct.
And so I have a very specific follow-up question to that, and I think the answer will be more where this individual and others with similar challenges can go for more information rather than walking through every step of the process here. But I will read the full one because it's a very timely agency. It comes from someone at CDC and asking, what if I have archive boxes full of TB trial patient files? So those may be from the 70s or earlier. Can I send them to be archived now? If not, then what are the steps to get 10,000 plus boxes for several trials ready?
So the first step for an agency, for the CDC, is to contact your records officer, because the records officer will be able to explain in detail what the processes are to get those, if they're archival, if they're historically valuable, to get that information to a federal record center. Involves how are they scheduled, what is their authority, and yes, 10,000 boxes is a lot, but we have the capability to store them. And it's important to note that when a federal record center stores records, they're still your records. So you control who has access, you control the servicing to pull them back when needed. So I would start with talking with the records officer, then we'll make the connections to how to handle those materials.
Very good, thank you. And then one questioner asked that they did not hear you explicitly mention the closure of federal record centers by 2022. Has there been a change in those plans?
I'm sorry, could you ask that question again?
Did not hear you mention the closure of federal record centers, and I think by that they mean agencies' own hard copy storage facilities. Has there been any change in the timeline or the plans for agencies no longer being able to have their own physical copy record centers?
All right. So what I'm hearing the question is, given the COVID-19 pandemic planning and how many agencies are pivoting all of their resources to figure out how to be effective and continue business as normal, there's going to be some delays. There's going to be some impacts. The plans that we are making have been changed. At this time, I have not received any indication from OMB or NARA executives that the deadlines have changed. So I am still looking, although I have to say I've been asking that same question. Are there any changes to the deadlines that we will want to put forward given the current situation? So no, I'm afraid those deadlines are still set at this time. But again, I'd recommend you watch Records Express or stay connected to our office, because if that changes, we will definitely communicate it very broadly.
Great. And then, to my knowledge, we're almost at time, and I've got two more questions I want to squeeze in here. One is whether records and data created in government offices by the agencies themselves, do they need to be handled differently than the same types of data that may be created under contract or agreements with outside organizations?
So contractors and contract records management. When contracts are set up, in general, there is some language that should be in there about when contractors create records for federal agencies, the output of those records are federal property. So, or the output of that contract, any records that created are federal, belong to the federal government. They are federal records. We have some recommended contract language on our website, which we encourage federal contracting officers and records officers to be aware of, so that they get that really clear discussion of, yes, for most contractors that are working for the federal government, especially when they have .gov emails, when they're producing information that is then used in other federal processes, and like their outputs, their reports, the data, whatever it is the contractors are doing, that records and information is generally federal, falls under the federal records purview, unless the contract says something very specific, like I'm using this data that I'm using a service which the contractor owns, and it's this part of the output that they're delivering and is a federal record. We are trying to work with the federal agency, with the FAR Council, the Federal Rules of Acquisition, thank you very much, and get that records management contract language a little bit clearer in the FAR, so that it's more easily understood and more easily implemented. So thank you for that question.
And then there's a question from a smaller agency that I think, like most agencies, has yet to transition 100% to electronic records and still has a fair number of print hard copies. You were talking about the urgency to get data to NARA before the deadline so that it can be, get hard copies to NARA before the deadline. But is there a retention period that the agencies must maintain before they can send those paper records to you?
As, hey, I still need these paper records. What do you mean I now have to send them to the National Archives or digitize? We're forcing some poor person to make a series of very difficult decisions. So the first question to be asked is, what is the active use period? How long do they need to be kept on site? Because they're being used on a regular basis, and we call that active use. You'll notice that the memo said inactive records should be transferred. So there is a difference between active and inactive, and the best person to help navigate that question are agency records officers who can look at the schedule, look at the periods of activities and say, yep, this one meets a threshold where we should be sending it to the Federal Records Center. The use is the inactive use or the infrequent use means that it's okay to wait a day or 2 days for those records to get pulled from the storage and sent back to us. So it's a series of decisions that have to be made. How valuable is the information in the paper? And you're talking about a very special situation. The information is valuable enough that I need to have it on hand in my agency building so that I can reference it when I need, but it's not valuable enough to require digitization or like scanning with OCR just to pull out that information. So for that specific scenario, I think we'll have to talk about that further.
Well, and we are past time here, so I really appreciate you setting the stage for this and answering the questions as they come in. And I know you're planning on sticking around in the online event and hopefully in the chat room where most of these questions have been coming. Some of them have been coming via email as well. And I'm going to tee up one final question that I ask you to take in the chat room because I think it will involve a link for people. But it was the very fundamental question of how do I find the records manager within my agency? And I know that that NARA has different working groups and rosters of senior agency records officers. But if you could take that in the chat room and just point people to the places where they start if they don't know where to turn.
I will absolutely do that in the chat. I will do that after it. It's from our records management webpage. I can describe it exactly. If you go to archives.gov/records management, the right side of our page has Connect with Us. And so under that connection, we have a list of every agency records officer and every agency senior agency official for records management. And then from there, it's there. By the way, the National Archives counts agencies. I believe we're at 274. And for every agency, we have an officially designated agency records officer who's the point person. Link in the chat after while the next speaker's talking.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and very much appreciate your contributions today and your work on this effort more